He was just another man with a gun. 24 hours ago, this would have created fear and terror. But now, it was just another day in travelling in Eastern Europe. I was a 23-year-old Aussie girl on my way to my first humanitarian exercise, working as a nurse in a Romanian orphanage. My travelling companions were Sophie and Raoul. I'd only met them less than 24 hours before. That was at the Bosnian and Serbian border. I was on a crowded bus, and I was pulled off that bus in the middle of the night by a guard with the biggest gun I have ever seen. He took me to a shipping container that was operating as a visa office at the border. And I was told that I needed a visa and I had to pay cash in a foreign currency that I didn't have. I started to panic. What will I do if I get left behind at this border in the middle of the night with this guard with this enormous gun? And at that point, Sophie and Raoul entered the shipping container. They saw what was happening and offered to pay for my visa. Since they were travelling to Romania as well, we decided to stick together. And now we found ourselves on a stationary train on the border between Serbia and Romania. We're in a little cabin, and the border guard threw the cabin door open and walked in. He was young, he looked barely 18, and he had a rifle slung over his shoulder. He said something to us that we didn't understand, and then when we looked at him blankly, he used his gun as a rough pointer, pointing from us to the window. And at that point, we jumped out of our seats and went and stood next to the window. And then we realised that he was actually searching the seats that we'd been sitting on, looking in case we were harbouring contraband underneath and the seat cavity underneath. We breathed a sigh of relief as he started to walk out of the cabin. But at the door, he turned around and he smiled at me flirtatiously. He's like, "You speak English. I speak little English." I mean, what was I supposed to do? When in Serbia, do what the Serbians do, right? So I flirted back. I'm like, "Oh, yay, that's amazing. You're awesome. Your English is fantastic. Good on you. Well done." He's like, "Thank you. Goodbye." And he left, closing the door behind him. Well, at that moment, I don't know if it was adrenaline or lack of sleep or just the sheer fear and relief of everything, but we just cracked up laughing. And Sophie said to me, "Did you just flirt with the border guard?" I was like, well, what else was I supposed to do? And we were laughing so hard that we could barely breathe, when all of a sudden the door was flung open again, this time by two enormous border officials. They yelled at us in a language we didn't understand, but we eventually understood they wanted our passports, so we gave them our passports and they began flicking through our passports and yelling some more. And then they yelled at us, presumably to stay in our seats, and they left the cabin with our passports in their hands. And so we waited, assuming that they were going to come back with our stamped passports in a minute. But then we waited some more, and then the train started moving. And all of a sudden, silence fell on the cabin. We realised how incredibly vulnerable we suddenly were. We were on a moving train in the middle of Eastern Europe without our passports. Well, I don't know what came over me. I just ignored that sick feeling in my stomach. And I stood up and I said to Raoul, "I'm going to go in search of our passports." Raoul was like torn between, the crazy Aussie chick and his girlfriend. He's like, "Oh, okay, I'll come with you, Sarah. And Sophie, just stay with the luggage." And so me and Raoul went out into the carriage and there was no sign of the guards anywhere. And so we got braver and we walked on and on through the train, carriage after carriage after carriage, as the train picked up speed heading into Romania. Well, eventually we bumped into those border guards with their huge bulky frame in the middle of the hallway. And they just threw our passports at us, yelled at us some more and then left. Well, I made it into Romania safely that day. But what I didn't know that day was that that border between Romania and Serbia is actually one of the hotspots for human trafficking in Europe. I'd never heard of human trafficking that day, but I was lucky I didn't become one of the statistics. At the orphanage that I worked at in Romania, girls used to go missing all the time. They told us that they'd run away or they'd been transferred to other institutions. But now, as I've spoken to many Romanian women in cities all over Europe, I'm pretty certain those girls were being trafficked out of that orphanage from under our noses. Although I didn't know it at the time, this was my first introduction to modern slavery.